I walked into my childhood home expecting a normal Thanksgiving dinner. The smell of turkey filled the air, and everyone was gathered around the dining room table. My sister Emma and her husband Brad were discussing their need for $40,000 to renovate their kitchen. When I mentioned needing help with my apartment security deposit, my mother Patricia turned to me with cold eyes. "Carter, you need to understand something. Your sister's family will always come first in our priorities. You are always last." My father Robert nodded in agreement. "That's just how it is, son." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there stunned, fork halfway to my mouth, as the weight of what my mother had just said sank in. But as the shock wore off, something else took its place. A terrible clarity. This wasn't news. This was just the first time anyone had said it out loud. I set down my fork and looked around the table. Emma was cutting her turkey into perfect little squares, the way she'd done since childhood. Brad was scrolling through his phone, probably looking at kitchen renovation photos. My parents were already moving on to other topics, as if they hadn't just delivered a devastating blow to their own son. The memories came flooding back, each one sharper than the last. When Emma turned 16, our parents surprised her with a brand new Honda Civic, metallic blue with that new car smell. I remember watching from my bedroom window as they presented her with the keys, all three of them laughing and hugging in the driveway. When I turned 16 6 months later, I got a cake and a card that said, "Happy birthday, son." No car, no explanation, just the unspoken understanding that Emma's milestones mattered more. College was even worse. Northwestern University, $52,000 per year, and our parents paid every penny without blinking. They drove up to Evanston for move-in day with a rented truck full of furniture for Emma's dorm room. A mini refrigerator, a matching bedding set, a desktop computer, and enough clothes to stock a small boutique. I was working 3 jobs that summer, saving every dollar I could for community college tuition. When I asked about help with school costs, Dad pulled me aside and explained that they'd already stretched themselves thin with Emma's education. "You understand, right, Carter? Emma's always been the academic one. This is her shot." I understood, all right. I understood that I was on my own. So I worked. Nights at a local warehouse, weekends at a grocery store, and any spare hours I could find doing lawn care around the neighborhood. I put myself through 2 years of community college, then transferred to the state university on a partial academic scholarship I'd earned through sheer determination. My parents didn't attend my community college graduation because Emma was having a baby shower that same weekend. They chose pastel decorations and gift bags over their son's achievement. Emma's wedding was a $68,000 affair, 300 guests, an open bar, and a 7-piece band. The reception hall looked like something from a magazine, with crystal chandeliers and centerpieces that cost more than I made in a month. I was expected to wear a rented tuxedo and smile for photos while my parents beamed with pride about their daughter's fairy tale day. When I graduated from the state university 2 years later with my degree in computer science, Emma was pregnant with her second child. My parents attended her baby shower instead of my graduation ceremony. I walked across that stage and looked out into the audience, searching for familiar faces in the crowd. Nothing. I called them that evening to share my excitement about landing my first real job. "That's nice, sweetie," Mom said. "But I can't talk long. Emma's having contractions, and we need to be ready to drive to the hospital." The house down payment was the final insult. $15,000, handed over without hesitation to help Emma and Brad secure their first home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a decent neighborhood. When I asked about borrowing $500 for textbooks the following semester, Dad frowned and said money was tight. "You're young and single, Carter. You can figure it out. Emma has a family to think about, and the babysitting." Every Friday and Saturday night, my parents would drive 30 minutes across town to watch Emma's kids so she and Brad could have date nights. They never charged a babysitting fee, never complained about the inconvenience, never mentioned how it cut into their own social plans. When I asked if they could watch my apartment while I went on a weekend camping trip with friends, Mom sighed like I'd asked her to donate a kidney. "We're not getting any younger, Carter. We can't be running all over creation." The pattern was so clear now, so undeniable. Every family gathering centered around Emma's latest crisis or achievement. Her promotion at the yoga studio, where she taught part-time classes, her children's piano recitals and soccer games, her struggles with potty training and homework help. I could share news about my job performance, my relationships, my goals and dreams, and the conversation would somehow circle back to Emma within minutes. "That's great about your promotion, Carter," Mom would say. "Speaking of work, Emma's been thinking about going back to nursing school. Maybe you could help her research programs? Even small things. Car insurance. I'd been paying my own since I turned 18, scraping together money every month for coverage on my used Honda that I'd bought with warehouse wages." Emma was 32 years old, and our parents still paid her car insurance. When I mentioned this once, Dad shrugged and said Emma had more expenses to worry about. I sat there at that Thanksgiving table, watching my family chat about Emma's kitchen renovation plans, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and familiar, but underneath it was something new, something that felt almost like relief. They'd finally said it out loud. The truth that had shaped every family interaction for the past 28 years. Emma comes first. Carter comes last. Always. I excused myself to use the bathroom, walked down the familiar hallway lined with family photos. Emma's school pictures from kindergarten through college graduation. Emma's wedding photos. Emma's children's baby pictures and school portraits. I counted exactly 3 photos of myself among the dozens covering the walls. Standing in that bathroom, looking at my reflection in the same mirror I'd used as a kid, I made a decision that would change everything. If I was going to be last in their priorities, I was going to be first in my own. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened completely. Over the next 18 months, I quietly restructured my entire life around a simple principle. If my family wasn't going to invest in me, I would invest in myself with laser focus. My career had been progressing better than anyone in my family realized. The computer science degree they'd barely acknowledged had landed me a position at a growing tech startup downtown. While they assumed I was struggling to make ends meet, I'd actually been promoted twice. My salary had jumped from $45,000 to $98,000 after I led a successful project that streamlined our client database system. But here's the thing nobody knew. I'd been living like I was still making $45,000. Same modest apartment, same 10-year-old Honda, same careful budgeting that I'd learned from years of financial necessity. The difference was that now, instead of every extra dollar going toward survival, it was going toward building something bigger. I opened investment accounts at 3 different firms, spreading my money across index funds, growth stocks, and a small cryptocurrency portfolio. I read financial planning books during lunch breaks and watched investment tutorials after work. While my family assumed I was barely scraping by, my portfolio had grown to $230,000. The real game changer came when our startup secured major funding from a Silicon Valley venture capital firm. They offered stock options to key employees, and I was included in that group. If the company went public as projected, those options could be worth $500,000 within 3 years. But the money was only part of the revolution. The bigger change was psychological. I stopped participating in the family dynamics that had drained my energy and self-worth for decades. When Emma needed help moving furniture, I had other plans. When my parents organized expensive group dinners where everyone was expected to split the bill equally regardless of income, I politely declined. When they discussed family vacation plans that would cost me a week's salary, I made my own travel arrangements. The separate holiday plan started small. Instead of driving 2 hours to spend Christmas Eve with extended family, I went skiing in Vermont with friends from work. Instead of obligatory Mother's Day brunch, where we'd sit around discussing Emma's parenting challenges, I took myself to a baseball game and bought the good seats behind home plate. I was dating someone now, too. Jessica Martinez, a nurse practitioner I'd met at a coffee shop near my office. She was intelligent, independent, and had her own complicated family dynamics that made her understand mine without judgment. What struck me most about Jessica was how she listened when I talked about my work, my interests, my goals. She remembered details about my projects and asked follow-up questions days later. It was such a contrast to family conversations where I felt invisible. Jessica was the first person outside my immediate family to hear the full story about the favoritism. We were sitting on her apartment balcony one evening, sharing takeout Chinese food and talking about our childhoods, when I found myself explaining why I never mentioned family gatherings or holiday plans. "It sounds like they trained you to expect less," she said quietly. "And you learned that lesson so well that even now, when you're succeeding, you still hide your achievements." She was right. I'd been so conditioned to downplay my accomplishments that even my closest friends didn't know about my financial success or career trajectory. I'd learned to make myself small to avoid threatening the family dynamic where Emma was the star and I was the supporting character. But Jessica challenged that mindset. She encouraged me to apply for leadership positions at work. She celebrated my investment gains like they were her own victories. When I mentioned that I'd been contributing to online technical forums and had built a reputation in my field, she suggested I start speaking at industry conferences. I began therapy around this time, working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a family therapist who specialized in adult children recovering from narcissistic family systems. The term golden child and scapegoat weren't familiar to me initially, but as Dr. Foster explained the dynamics, everything clicked into place. "Your family needed someone to carry the emotional burden of their dysfunction," she explained during one session. Emma was appointed the success story, the child who validated their parenting. You were assigned the role of the problem child, the one whose struggles made Emma's achievements shine brighter. The therapy helped me understand that my family's treatment wasn't about my worth as a person. It was about their need to maintain a system where roles were fixed and predictable. Emma was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the scapegoat who was blamed for anything that went wrong and ignored when things went right. Dr. Foster helped me practice setting boundaries. Not angry confrontations, but calm, consistent limits on my time, energy, and emotional availability. I stopped responding immediately to family group texts about money requests or guilt-inducing messages about missing family events. I developed standard phrases that I could use to deflect manipulation. "I'll think about it and get back to you. That doesn't work for my schedule. I have other commitments that day." The most important boundary was financial. I stopped participating in the expectation that I would contribute to family expenses while receiving nothing in return. No more group gifts where I paid my share for presents I had no input on choosing. No more emergency loans that were never repaid. No more splitting restaurant bills when Emma and Brad ordered expensive steaks while I had a salad. My friend Marcus Chen from work noticed the change in my confidence and demeanor. "You seem different lately," he said one Friday afternoon as we were wrapping up a project, "more focused. Like you figured something out." He was right. I had figured something out. I'd learned that family loyalty doesn't require self-sacrifice. Love doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. And success doesn't have to be hidden to make other people comfortable. The test of my new boundaries came sooner than expected. On a Wednesday evening in March, my phone rang. Emma's name flashed on the screen. She only called when she needed something, so I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won out. "Carter," she said, and her voice was shaking. "I need to talk to you. Something terrible has happened, and I don't know what we're going to do." Emma was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. Between the tears and broken sentences, a story emerged that was worse than anything I could have imagined. The perfect life that my family had spent years prioritizing and protecting was built on lies, fraud, and financial crimes. Brad's real estate career had been struggling for months. In a competitive market where established agents dominated, he'd been desperate to close deals and build his reputation. The pressure to maintain their lifestyle, combined with Emma's expectations and my parents' constant praise for his entrepreneurial spirit, had driven him to make increasingly dangerous choices. He'd been falsifying mortgage applications, income statements, employment verification letters, credit reports. He'd created an elaborate system of fake documents to help clients who couldn't qualify for loans secure mortgages they couldn't afford. The commission checks had been substantial, and for a while, it seemed like Brad had found his groove in the real estate world. But mortgage fraud is a federal crime, and the investigation had been building for months. Bank auditors had noticed patterns in the applications Brad submitted. Employment verification calls to phone numbers that led to disconnected lines. Tax documents with inconsistencies that triggered red flags in underwriting systems. Income figures that didn't match IRS databases. When federal agents executed the search warrant at Brad's office, they found a box full of falsified documents with his signature on them. His real estate license was immediately suspended pending investigation. Criminal charges were filed 3 days later. He was facing potential federal prison time of up to 20 years. But Brad's crimes were only half the story. While he was fabricating mortgage applications, Emma had been living a financial fantasy that made the fraud seem almost inevitable. She'd opened credit cards in her name, Brad's name, and even my parents' names with their permission. The debt had spiraled completely out of control, $43,000. That's what Emma owed across 7 different credit cards. Designer clothes for herself and the children, expensive dinners and weekend trips, a kitchen renovation that had cost twice what they'd planned, private yoga instructor certification courses that she'd never completed. All of it charged to credit cards with the assumption that Brad's income would eventually catch up to their spending. The house payments had stopped 6 months earlier. Brad had told Emma he was handling the mortgage, but in reality, he'd been using the mortgage money to cover credit card minimum payments and daily expenses. The foreclosure notice had arrived 4 weeks ago. They had 90 days to bring the account current or lose the house entirely. Emma's car had been repossessed the previous Tuesday. She'd been loading groceries when the tow truck arrived. The children were in the back seat, and she'd had to call a neighbor to come get them while she watched her Honda Pilot get hooked up and driven away. The humiliation had been crushing, but worse than the embarrassment was the practical reality. She now had no way to get to work or drive the kids to school. The private school tuition was 3 months behind. The children's school had been patient, understanding that families sometimes faced temporary financial difficulties. But the patience was running out. The principal had called that morning to say that unless the account was brought current by Friday, the children would need to find new schools immediately. Legal fees were mounting daily. Brad's criminal defense attorney required a $25,000 retainer just to begin working on the case. They'd already paid $28,000, draining their savings account and Emma's retirement fund from her previous nursing job. The attorney estimated that the total legal costs could reach $60,000, depending on whether the case went to trial. But perhaps the most devastating part of Emma's confession was how long they'd been living in denial. Friends and extended family had no idea about their financial situation. Emma had been maintaining the facade of success right up until the moment it all collapsed. She'd been posting photos of family vacations on social media while charging the trips to credit cards. She'd been buying expensive gifts for the children's birthdays while ignoring collection notices in the mailbox. The children had been asking questions that Emma couldn't answer. Why did Daddy seem angry all the time? Why were there strange men in suits coming to the house? Why couldn't they go to their friends' birthday parties anymore? Emma had been protecting them from the truth, but the truth was becoming impossible to hide. "Carter," she whispered through the phone, "I'm scared we're going to lose everything. The house, the kids' schools, Brad might go to prison. I don't know how we got here, and I don't know how to fix it." The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Emma had been the family success story, the golden child who could do no wrong, the one whose needs always came first. And now, the lifestyle that my parents had enabled and celebrated had led to financial ruin and potential federal crimes. As Emma continued crying, explaining how their credit scores were destroyed and they couldn't qualify for any loans or rental agreements, I realized something profound was happening. The family dynamic that had positioned me as the failure and Emma as the success had just completely inverted. The responsible, steady financial habits I'd learned from being ignored and overlooked had made me stable and secure. The entitled, impulsive spending that had been celebrated as Emma living her best life had led to disaster. "Have you told Mom and Dad about all of this?" I asked. "Some of it," Emma admitted, "but not everything. They're already panicking about what they can do to help, and their retirement savings can't cover something this big. Brad's parents said they won't help because he defaulted on loans from them before. Carter, You're the only one who might be able to help us." And there it was. The phone call I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life. The moment when the family that had always put me last would finally need me first. The question was what I would choose to do with that power. "I need time to think about this, Emma," I said. "This is a lot to process." "How much time?" she asked urgently. "Because the foreclosure deadline is next month, and Brad's sentencing hearing is in 6 weeks. 24 hours, I told her. "I'll call you tomorrow evening." As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything was about to change. The family that had spent 28 years teaching me that I didn't matter was about to learn exactly how much I mattered after all. The emergency family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. Emma had called ahead to say that Carter needed to be there to discuss the family situation. The implication was clear. This wasn't a request for help. This was an expectation of rescue. I arrived to find Emma sitting on the living room couch with tissues in her lap, her eyes red from crying. Brad sat beside her, staring at his hands with the defeated expression of someone whose lies had finally caught up with him. My parents were in their matching recliners, looking older and more stressed than I'd seen them in years. The coffee table was covered with financial documents, bank statements, credit card bills, legal papers, foreclosure notices. A calculator sat next to a yellow legal pad covered with my father's handwriting, numbers and calculations that told the story of a family in financial freefall. "Carter," my mother said, as soon as I sat down, "we need to talk about how you're going to help your sister through this crisis. Not if I was going to help, how I was going to help." The assumption of my compliance was built into the very structure of the conversation. My father cleared his throat and picked up the legal pad. "We've been going through all the numbers, son, and we think we have a plan that could work, but it requires everyone in the family to step up." He began reading from his calculations. The total amount needed to solve Emma and Brad's immediate problems was $78,000. This would cover the outstanding mortgage payments, to stop the foreclosure, bring the credit card accounts current, pay the children's school tuition, and provide a cushion for Brad's ongoing legal fees. "Now, your mother and I can contribute $30,000 from our retirement savings," Dad continued. "We know that's a sacrifice for us, but family comes first. Emma and Brad will need to sell some possessions and take out a loan against Brad's truck, which should bring in another $15,000. That leaves $33,000 that we need to cover." He looked at me directly. "We figure if you liquidate your savings account and take out some loans, you should be able to handle that amount." The casual way he said liquidate your savings account was breathtaking. They had no idea how much money I had saved, no knowledge of my investments or income, no understanding of my financial situation, but they assumed I would simply drain whatever resources I had to solve Emma's problems. "We've also been thinking," my mother added, "that it would make sense for you to move back home for a while. You could save money on rent and use that savings to help cover the ongoing expenses while Brad gets back on his feet." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Carter, it would be such a relief to know that you were helping coordinate everything. You could co-sign for a new apartment lease since our credit is destroyed. Maybe help us find a financial planner to get back on track." The plan they were proposing wasn't just financial assistance. It was a complete restructuring of my life around Emma's crisis. I would become the family's financial manager, responsible for digging them out of a hole created by years of entitlement and poor choices. "I need you to understand something, Carter," my mother said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "This is not optional. Family takes care of family. Period. This is what we do for each other." My father's tone was equally firm. "If you don't step up now, if you leave your sister hanging when she needs you most, then you're not really part of this family. You need to decide what's more important, your money or your family." The emotional manipulation was staggering. They were framing my potential refusal to bankrupt myself as a betrayal of family loyalty, as if my reluctance to solve problems I didn't create was evidence that I didn't love them. Emma leaned forward, her eyes filling with tears again. "Carter, the kids have been asking about you. They want to know why Uncle Carter doesn't come around as much anymore. How am I supposed to explain that their uncle doesn't love them enough to help when they're in trouble?" Brad finally spoke, his voice quiet but entitled. "Look, I know I made mistakes, but we're family, right? Families forgive each other and move forward together." The assumption underlying every word was that my resources were their resources, that my financial stability was simply a tool to be used for Emma's benefit, that my years of careful planning and responsible choices existed for the sole purpose of bailing them out when their irresponsible choices caught up with them. "We've already told your Aunt Linda and Uncle Frank that you're handling the financial side of this situation," my mother continued. "They were so impressed with how responsible and successful you've become. Everyone's counting on you, Carter." They'd already promised my help without asking my permission. They'd committed my money and my time to solving Emma's problems before even discussing it with me. The arrogance was stunning. "And just so we're clear," my father added, consulting his legal pad again, "we're not talking about a gift here. Emma and Brad will pay you back once Brad gets his real estate license reinstated and finds steady work again. This is a family loan to help them get through a rough patch. A family loan. As if Brad's history of defaulting on loans from his own parents wasn't a clear indicator of how likely repayment would be. As if Emma's pattern of spending beyond her means suggested that future fiscal responsibility was probable. "We need an answer today, Carter," my mother said. "The foreclosure deadline doesn't care about our family discussions. The school needs tuition payment by Friday. Brad's attorney needs his retainer by next week. This can't wait." The pressure was overwhelming. 28 years of conditioning told me to comply, to sacrifice, to put Emma's needs before my own. Every family gathering where I'd been made to feel selfish for wanting equal treatment, every holiday where my achievements were overlooked in favor of Emma's latest drama, every conversation where my financial struggles had been dismissed, while Emma's financial wants were treated as emergencies. But something had changed in me over the past 18 months. The therapy sessions with Dr. Foster, the relationship with Jessica that showed me what mutual respect looked like, the financial security I'd built through my own efforts, the boundaries I'd learned to set and maintain. "I need 24 hours to figure out the logistics," I said carefully. "This is a big financial commitment, and I need to review my accounts and see what's possible." The relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. They heard my request for time as agreement to their plan. Emma reached over and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Carter. I knew you wouldn't abandon us." My father nodded approvingly. "That's the responsible approach, son. Take the time you need to work out the details." My mother was already mentally spending the money. "Once this gets resolved, we can start planning for Christmas like normal. Maybe Emma and Brad could host this year, once they're back on their feet." As I drove home that evening, I realized that my family had just made a crucial mistake. They'd revealed exactly how little they thought of me, how completely they took my compliance for granted, and how deeply they misunderstood the person I'd become. They were about to learn that the quiet, responsible Carter who'd been overlooked for decades was also strong enough to say no. More importantly, they were about to discover that the financial resources they assumed they could access belonged to someone who'd learned the hard way that respect isn't given freely. It has to be earned. I asked Jessica to come with me to the follow-up meeting. If my family was going to learn who I really was, I wanted someone there who actually knew me. Someone who could witness what was about to happen and help me stay centered when the emotional manipulation started. We arrived at my parents' house Monday evening to find the same scene as the day before. Documents spread across the coffee table, my parents in their recliners, Emma and Brad on the couch looking expectant. They'd assumed my request for 24 hours was just a formality, that I was working out the practical details of their rescue plan. "Carter," my mother said as soon as we sat down, "we're so proud of you for stepping up like this. It shows real maturity and family loyalty." Emma was smiling for the first time in weeks. "Did you figure out how to access your savings? We were thinking maybe you could handle the mortgage payment first, since that deadline is the most urgent." Brad nodded eagerly. "I really appreciate this, Carter. I know it's a sacrifice, and I promise we'll pay you back as soon as I get my license reinstated." I pulled out a folder that I'd prepared the night before. Bank statements from my checking and savings accounts, investment portfolio summaries, tax returns from the past 3 years. a detailed breakdown of my assets and income that painted a very different picture than the one my family had constructed in their minds. "Before we talk about what I'm going to do," I said calmly, "I think you should know what I'm actually capable of doing." I handed the first document to my father. His checking account balance showed $973. Then I showed him my checking account statement, $48,000. My mother's eyes widened as she looked at my savings account balance, $112,000. Then came the investment portfolio summary, $231,000 across various accounts, with detailed breakdowns showing consistent monthly contributions over the past 5 years. Emma's mouth fell open when she saw my most recent tax return. Gross income, $98,000. After taxes and deductions, my take-home pay was more than my parents' combined retirement income. "I don't understand," my father said slowly. "You never mentioned that you were doing so well financially." "You never asked," I replied. "In fact, you've never asked about my career, my goals, my relationships, or my life in general. You've spent 28 years assuming I was struggling and needed guidance, when the reality is that I've been building wealth and success while you were focused on Emma's problems." I pulled out another document, my employment contract showing the stock options I'd been granted. If the company went public as projected, those options would be worth between $400,000 and $600,000 within the next 2 years. "You could have helped all along," Emma said, her voice a mixture of hurt and accusation. "You've been sitting on all this money while we were struggling. I've been building financial security while you were making choices that led to criminal fraud and massive debt," I corrected. "There's a difference between struggling and creating problems through poor decisions." Jessica spoke up for the first time. "I've been dating Carter for 8 months, and I've watched your family treat him like he was invisible. You've never once asked about his work promotions, his investment success, or his future plans. But you immediately assumed he'd liquidate everything to solve problems he didn't create." My mother's face flushed red. "That's not fair. Carter never told us about his financial situation, because every time he tried to share good news, you'd change the subject to Emma's latest crisis," Jessica continued. "I've heard him try to tell you about his achievements, and I've watched you dismiss them or ignore them completely." I pulled out my phone and showed them photos from the Hawaii vacation Jessica and I had taken 3 months earlier. 5 days in Maui, staying at a resort that cost more per night than their monthly car payments. They had no idea I'd even left the country. "I've been living a completely separate life from this family because there was no room for me in the life you've constructed around Emma's needs," I said. "I have a successful career, a healthy relationship, financial security, and personal goals that extend far beyond managing family crises." Brad looked confused and slightly angry. "If you have all this money, why wouldn't you just help us out? We're family. Because having resources doesn't create an obligation to rescue people from the consequences of their choices," I said. "And because this family has spent decades teaching me that my value is measured by what I can provide for Emma's benefit." I laid out the pattern systematically. Every birthday where Emma received expensive gifts while I got token acknowledgments. Every family gathering where Emma's achievements were celebrated while mine were overlooked. Every financial emergency where Emma received immediate help while my requests for assistance were denied. "You told me on Thanksgiving that Emma's family will always come first and I will always come last," I continued. "You were honest about your priorities, and I've decided to be honest about mine. I'm putting my own financial security and future first for once." My father looked at the tax returns again. "But son, if you can afford to help, doesn't that create some moral obligation to your family? The same moral obligation that existed when I needed help with textbooks, or when I was working 3 jobs to pay for college, or when I asked to borrow $500 while you were giving Emma $15,000 for a house down payment." The room fell silent as the hypocrisy sank in. They'd created a family dynamic where my needs were dismissed, and Emma's wants were treated as emergencies. Now they wanted to invoke family loyalty to access resources they'd never acknowledged existed. "I'm willing to help," I said finally, "but not on the terms you've proposed. If you want my financial assistance, we're going to restructure this entire family dynamic first." Emma looked hopeful. "What do you mean?" "I mean therapy for everyone to address the favoritism and toxic patterns. I mean equal treatment and respect moving forward. I mean written agreements for any financial assistance with clear repayment terms and consequences for default. I mean acknowledgement of how this family has treated me and concrete changes to ensure it doesn't continue. My mother bristled. You can't hold your family hostage with conditions and demands. I'm not holding anyone hostage, I replied. I'm offering to help on terms that respect my value as a family member. If those terms are unacceptable, you're free to find other solutions to problems I didn't create. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Suddenly, they needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. And for the first time in my life, I was in a position to demand the respect and equality I'd always deserved. What exactly are you proposing? My father asked quietly. I opened my folder to the final document, a detailed proposal I'd drafted with the help of an attorney friend. Terms, conditions, timelines, and consequences. A framework for family financial assistance that treated all parties as adults with equal dignity and responsibility. This is what I'm offering, I said. Take it or leave it. The document I placed on the coffee table was unlike anything my family had expected. Instead of a simple promise to write checks, it was a comprehensive agreement that would fundamentally change how our family operated. I'm prepared to provide $60,000 to address Emma and Brad's immediate crisis, I began, reading from the first page. But this assistance comes in the form of a structured loan, not a gift. The loan carries 4% annual interest and must be repaid over 5 years in monthly installments of $1,150. Emma's face fell. Monthly payments? Carter, we can barely afford our basic expenses right now. Which brings us to the second requirement, I continued. Emma and Brad must complete a certified financial literacy course within 90 days. The course must be approved by a nonprofit credit counseling agency, and you must provide proof of completion before receiving any loan proceeds. Brad shifted uncomfortably. That seems like a lot of hoops to jump through for family help. Less complicated than federal prison for mortgage fraud, I replied evenly. The third requirement is family therapy. All of us. 6 months of regular sessions with a therapist I select, focusing specifically on family dynamics, favoritism patterns, and healthy communication. My mother's voice was sharp with indignation. You want to drag us to therapy like we're some kind of dysfunctional family? We are some kind of dysfunctional family, Jessica interjected. Healthy families don't systematically favor one child while ignoring another for 3 decades. I turned to the next page. The fourth requirement is public acknowledgement. At the next extended family gathering, Mom and Dad will publicly acknowledge the pattern of favoritism in our family and apologize for the differential treatment I've received throughout my life. My father looked stunned. You want us to humiliate ourselves in front of the whole family? I want you to tell the truth in front of the whole family, I corrected. The same family you told that I was handling Emma's financial crisis without asking my permission first. The fifth requirement addressed future financial requests. Any family member asking for financial assistance would need to submit a written proposal with clear repayment terms. No more emergency loans with vague promises of eventual repayment. No more group expenses where costs were automatically divided without regard for income differences. Emma, I continued, you'll need to write a letter to all the extended family members who've heard about your financial problems, acknowledging that you've been receiving preferential financial treatment from our parents for years, and that I've been unfairly characterized as less successful or responsible. Emma's eyes filled with tears. That's so embarrassing, Carter. Everyone will think differently about me. Everyone will think accurately about you, I said. The embarrassment you're feeling is what I've felt at every family gathering where my achievements were ignored while yours were celebrated. The sixth requirement was about Brad's employment. He needed to complete an anger management course and provide proof of stable employment for at least 3 months before receiving the final portion of the loan. You don't have anger management problems, Brad protested. You committed federal crimes because you couldn't handle the pressure of providing for your family through legitimate means, I replied. That suggests some issues with emotional regulation that therapy could address. The seventh requirement established new boundaries for family interactions. Holiday planning would involve input from all family members, not just Emma's preferences. Gift exchanges would have reasonable spending limits. Restaurant meals would be ordered with individual payment responsibility, not automatic bill splitting. And Jessica, I added, looking at my girlfriend, will be treated as a full family member, included in planning discussions, holiday invitations, and family communications. No more treating my relationship as less important than Emma's marriage. My mother was reading through the document with growing dismay. This feels like you're punishing us for trying to help Emma through a difficult time. This feels like me demanding the respect and equality I should have received my entire life, I countered. The fact that basic fairness feels like punishment shows how skewed this family's perspective has become. The eighth requirement was perhaps the most important: ongoing accountability. Monthly check-ins where loan payments were verified, therapy attendance was confirmed, and family dynamics were honestly assessed. If the family reverted to old patterns of favoritism and disrespect, I retained the right to call the entire loan due immediately. The ninth and final requirement, I said, is that when I get married, buy a house, or have other major life events, our parents will contribute equally to those occasions as they did for Emma's wedding and house down payment. My father was calculating numbers on his legal pad. Carter, some of these requirements feel very harsh. We're already facing a difficult financial situation. You're facing consequences for choices that were made over many years, I said. Emma and Brad chose to live beyond their means. You and Mom chose to enable that lifestyle while ignoring my financial responsibility. Now you're choosing whether to accept help with conditions that ensure this pattern doesn't continue. Emma looked at Brad, then back at me. What if we can't meet all these requirements? What if the therapy doesn't work or we struggle with the payments? Then you'll face the consequences of your choices without my resources, I said simply. The same way I faced the consequences of your choices for the first 28 years of my life. The room fell silent as they absorbed the magnitude of what I was proposing. This wasn't just financial assistance. It was a complete restructuring of family relationships around principles of mutual respect and equal treatment. How long do we have to decide? My mother asked. 24 hours, I said. The same amount of time you gave me to liquidate my savings and restructure my life around Emma's crisis. Jessica and I stood to leave. As we reached the door, my father called out, "Carter, what happens if we say no to your conditions?" I turned back to face them. Then you solve your problems the same way I solved mine. Through hard work, personal responsibility, and learning that actions have consequences. We walked to the car in silence. As I started the engine, Jessica placed her hand over mine. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do," she said quietly. For the first time in my adult life, I'd used my power to demand justice instead of hoping for charity. Tomorrow, I'd learn whether my family valued my resources more than their pride. 6 months later, I sat in Dr. Foster's office with my entire family for what would be our final group therapy session. The transformation had been gradual, sometimes painful, but ultimately profound. The people sitting around me bore little resemblance to the family that had gathered for that emergency meeting in my parents' living room. Emma and Brad had completed their financial literacy course with honors. The instructor had commented that their dedication to learning budgeting and debt management was among the best she'd seen in 15 years of teaching. More importantly, they'd been making their monthly loan payments on time every month. $1,150, transferred to my account on the 15th of each month, without exception. Brad had found steady work as a construction project manager, a job that utilized his organizational skills without the temptation of commission-based fraud. His anger management counseling had helped him develop healthier coping strategies for stress and financial pressure. The criminal charges were still pending, but his attorney was optimistic about a plea agreement that would involve community service and restitution rather than prison time. Emma had returned to nursing full-time, taking a position at the regional medical center that paid $42,000 per year. She'd also started a small side business providing respite care for elderly patients, which brought in an additional $800 monthly. For the first time in their marriage, Emma and Brad had a detailed budget and were living within their means. The children had adjusted better than anyone expected to their new public school. Without the pressure of maintaining appearances at an expensive private academy, they seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy. Emma had been surprised to discover that public school teachers were just as dedicated as private school faculty, and the diversity of their new classmates had been enriching rather than limiting. My parents had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The family therapy had forced them to confront patterns of behavior they'd never consciously acknowledged. Dr. Foster had helped them understand how their well-intentioned efforts to help Emma succeed had actually created dependency and entitlement, while simultaneously teaching me that love was conditional on self-sacrifice. "I never realized," my mother said during one particularly emotional session, "that we were sending Carter the message that his needs didn't matter. I thought we were just supporting the child, who seemed to need more help." The public acknowledgement at Thanksgiving dinner had been awkward, but healing. In front of 15 extended family members, my parents had taken responsibility for decades of favoritism and apologized for the impact on my self-worth and our family relationships. Several aunts and uncles had approached me privately afterward to say they'd noticed the pattern but hadn't known how to address it. The monthly family dinners had become genuinely enjoyable rather than obligatory. Conversations now included updates about my work projects, investment strategies, and relationship with Jessica. When I announced my promotion to senior software engineer, my parents celebrated with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for Emma's achievements. When I shared news about our startup's successful funding round, my father asked thoughtful questions about equity distribution and growth projections. Jessica had been welcomed into the family with warmth that felt authentic rather than forced. She participated in holiday planning, contributed ideas for family activities, and developed a particularly close relationship with my mother around their shared interest in gardening. My parents had even asked Jessica about her family traditions and incorporated some of her suggestions into our celebrations. The most significant change was in my relationship with Emma. The therapy had helped her understand how her acceptance of preferential treatment had damaged our sibling bond. She'd written heartfelt letters to extended family members, taking responsibility for the financial crisis and acknowledging the support system she'd taken for granted. "I realize now that I never really knew you," Emma had said during one of our individual conversations. "I knew the version of Carter who existed to solve my problems, but I never bothered to learn about your dreams, your achievements, your struggles that weren't related to helping me." Dr. Foster had explained that healthy families celebrate each member's successes and support each other through challenges without creating hierarchies of worth. The goal wasn't to reverse the favoritism and make me the golden child, but to create space for both Emma and me to be valued for our individual strengths and supported through our individual challenges. The financial boundaries had become second nature to our family interactions. When Emma and Brad needed a new washing machine, they researched options, saved money, and purchased it themselves. When my parents wanted to take a vacation for their anniversary, they planned within their budget rather than expecting family contributions. When I mentioned wanting to upgrade my apartment, they offered emotional support and practical advice rather than assuming I needed financial help. My investment portfolio had grown to $430,000, and the startup's IPO was scheduled for early next year. The stock options I'd been granted could potentially make me a millionaire by my 30th birthday. But more important than the money was the knowledge that I'd built this success through my own efforts and decisions. Jessica and I had gotten engaged 3 months earlier. True to the agreement, my parents had offered to contribute $15,000 toward our wedding, the same amount they'd spent on Emma's. We'd graciously accepted their offer and used it to plan a celebration that reflected our values and preferences rather than trying to impress others or maintain appearances. The wedding planning had revealed another positive change in our family dynamics. Instead of automatically deferring to the bride's family for all decisions, both families collaborated on creating an event that honored Jessica's Mexican-American heritage and my family's traditions. My parents had enthusiastically learned about Mexican wedding customs and incorporated elements that made Jessica feel truly welcomed. As our final therapy session concluded, Dr. Foster asked each of us to share one thing we'd learned about ourselves and one thing we'd learned about our family. "I learned that I'd been confusing enabling with love," my mother said. "I thought protecting Emma from consequences was helping her, but it was actually preventing her from developing resilience and responsibility." My father nodded. I learned that staying silent when I saw favoritism made me complicit in creating an unhealthy family system. I should have spoken up years ago. Brad surprised everyone with his insight. I learned that I'd been using Emma's family support as a crutch to avoid dealing with my own insecurities and career challenges. The fraud happened because I was trying to maintain a lifestyle we couldn't afford, rather than building a career we could be proud of. Emma's response was the most emotional. I learned that I'd built my entire identity around being the child who needed rescuing. I never developed confidence in my own abilities because I always knew someone would fix my problems. Now I'm proud of what I can accomplish on my own. When it was my turn, I looked around at these people who'd caused me so much pain but who'd also worked genuinely hard to change. I learned that setting boundaries isn't cruel or selfish. It's actually a form of love because it creates space for authentic relationships. And I learned that this family is capable of growth and change when we're all willing to do the work. Dr. Foster smiled as she closed her notes. You've all demonstrated something remarkable. You've shown that even deeply entrenched family patterns can be changed when people are committed to honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. As we left the therapy office that day, my family felt different. Not perfect, but functional. Not without challenges, but equipped to address them together. The hierarchy of worth that had defined our relationships for decades had been replaced by a foundation of equality and genuine care. 6 weeks later, Jessica and I were married in a ceremony that perfectly blended our families and traditions. My parents walked me down the aisle with pride and joy that felt completely authentic. Emma served as one of Jessica's bridesmaids, and her children were enthusiastic participants in the ceremony. Brad, now 18 months sober and focused on rebuilding his reputation, had become someone I could genuinely respect. During the reception, my father gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Carter," he said, "you taught us that love isn't about giving someone everything they want. It's about seeing who they really are and supporting them in becoming the best version of themselves. Thank you for having the courage to demand the respect you deserved and for giving us the opportunity to become the family we should have been all along." The lesson I'd learned through this entire experience was simple but profound. You teach people how to treat you through what you accept and what you reject. For 28 years, I'd accepted being treated as less important than Emma because I didn't believe I deserved better. When I finally demanded equality, my family had a choice: respect my worth or lose my presence. They chose respect, and we all became stronger for it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes fighting for justice requires risking relationships. And sometimes, when you stop trying to earn love through sacrifice, you discover that you were worthy of love all along. The family that had once put me last had learned to put everyone first, and that made all the difference. As Jessica and I drove away from our wedding reception toward our honeymoon in Italy, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. The startup had gone public 2 months earlier, and my stock options were now worth $800,000. But the real wealth wasn't in my investment portfolio. It was in the relationships I'd fought to heal, the boundaries I'd learned to maintain, and the family I'd helped transform through courage and love. Have you ever found yourself in a family situation where you felt overlooked or undervalued? What did you do to change the dynamic, and how did it turn out? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories about family relationships, personal growth, and finding the courage to demand the respect you deserve. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they're worthy of equal treatment in their own family. Thank you for watching, and remember that you have the power to change even the most entrenched family patterns when you're willing to stand up for what's right.